Hey guys, I'd like to welcome John Pomfret to the show. He is an investigative journalist who have written the upcoming book From Warsaw with Love, Polish Spies, the CIA, and the Making of an Unlikely Alliance. John, you want to say hello?
Oh, hi, Paul.
Hey, John, my first question is, what inspired you to write this book?
So first, thanks for having me on the show, Paul. In 1992, I was sent to Eastern Europe, basically to cover the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. But at the time, the Post Bureau was still located in Warsaw, kind of a throwback to the days when Poland really was the epicenter of events happening in Eastern Europe. And in 1994, I began on my return trips to Warsaw from kind of downtime after covering the events in Sarajevo. I began to pick up these rumors that Polish intelligence had saved 6 Americans somehow in Iraq in 1990. And I collected string on these rumors and interviewed people and finally sort of discovered the story of how Polish intelligence in 1990 had dispatched a senior ex-communist spy to Baghdad to save these Americans. And in 1995, in January, it ran on the front page of the Washington Post. And I'd always thought that that story could make the centerpiece, the kernel of a really interesting book, but I didn't know what the backstory was. And as time passed, I didn't know what the front story was. Mm-hmm. And so from starting in about 2012, 2013, I began to collect string on it and sort of pull on that string, if you will. Mm-hmm. And over time, that string became a cord and then a cable and a rope, and it turned into the story today.
My understanding is that the book covers the relationship from the fall of communism, correct?
Yeah, it starts before that because it has to do with the relationships between the intelligence agencies. And even during communist times, the CIA actually had CIA officers had personal relationships with their Polish counterparts. The CIA formally also had a relationship with Polish intelligence through the secret purchase of Eastern European Soviet bloc weaponry from Poland to funnel to the Iran-Contras. And the CIA was also very much enamored with Polish spy tradecraft, in particular the tradecraft of one Marian Zacharski, who was a Polish spy operating in Los Angeles in the late 70s and the early 80s before he was arrested and then exchanged on the Bridge of Spies in 1985.
Okay. One question I have is, after communism, do you get the feeling that there was a change in the intelligence agents in Poland, or do they mostly remain the same?
So what happened in 1990 was that the CIA began to reach out to the Foreign Intelligence Bureau of it's Department 1 of the SB, the Polish Secret sort of in services, right? And that was a massive organization involving the Foreign Intelligence Bureau was actually quite small, about 1,000 people, but the SB had tens of thousands of people. And the CIA lobbied the Polish government, with the government of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, not to dismantle their Foreign Intelligence Bureau and fire all these ex-communist officers for several reasons. One is that the CIA respected the tradecraft of Polish communist era spies. So the case of Zacharski was an example. But two, the CIA also believed that if Poland completely decommunized, went through total what they called lustration, then and fired everybody who was a communist, then Poland's transition to a republic would be very difficult because there were many communists in Poland. And if they didn't have a stake in the new Poland because they'd been fired, they could cause a lot of trouble. And so there were two reasons. And the CIA was very important in that debate, that internal debate in Poland about what to do about the communist bureaucracy. And so if you recall, there was Mazowiecki's, the prime minister's speech of drawing a thick line between the past and the present. And so the CIA played a pretty significant role, as did the US government, in saying to the Polish government, the new Polish government, the government of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, hey, don't destroy the system, because if you do, those people whom you fire could actually go into the woods, if you will, and cause a counter-revolution. And so in 1990, when the CIA began to liaise with the Foreign Intelligence Bureau underwent a vetting process like the rest of the SB did to fire some officers who were particularly brutal, et cetera. But in fact, only 3 officers from the Foreign Intelligence Bureau of the SB were fired. So most of those officers in the initial phase of the creation of the alliance were ex-communists, but very soon, new officers were hired. People like Piotr Niemczek were brought in to work with, and these officers, these people had solidarity backgrounds, to work with the ex-communist officers.
Okay, I see. And in Poland at that time, we were very enamored with Americans. Like we viewed America as the best country in the world, like, you know, our savior, everything we could aspire to, right? So I'm not sure about what the relationship of these guys were, but the general population of the time loved America. So I imagine there was a lot of cooperation with American intelligence officials.
So it was very interesting. The CIA during communist times had deeply penetrated the Polish military, in the case of Ryszard Kuklinski, but they also had penetrated the Polish intelligence. And so when the CIA began to publicly liaise with the Foreign Intelligence Bureau in 1990, right, openly liaise, several of the CIA officers found themselves in an unusual situation of having meetings with Polish intelligence, with people who had actually worked secretly as agents of the CIA during communist times. And so that was an odd situation, because they too, many of them were also quite sympathetic to the West. I mean, these are men and women, but mostly men, who'd been posted overseas in Western countries like Canada and the US, and had seen how much more successful those societies were than Poland's Soviet-dominated society at the time.
Could you tell us the lead up to what happened in Iraq?
Yeah, certainly. So in March of 1990, a CIA officer named John Palovich had already cleared this mission with the CIA headquarters in Langley. He goes to Lisbon and basically rings the doorbell of the Polish embassy in Lisbon and reaches out to a Polish intelligence officer by the name of Ryszard Tomaszewski. Now, Tomaszewski, who actually went by the name Ricardo, because he's in Portugal, was masquerading as a consular officer. And Palovich enters the guy's office and hands him his real passport, because Palovich, over the course of his career, had used 6 fake passports, actually maybe 7 fake passports, and announced himself. He said, "Hey, I'm a CIA officer, and my agency wants to begin a formal relationship with your agency. Can you run it by your bosses in Warsaw?" And Tomaszewski's like, and this is in the embassy, "What are you doing? I'm not a CIA officer. How could you say this? I'm just a consular officer. You found the wrong guy." Of course, it was true. Tomaszewski was a Polish intelligence officer. And after kicking Palovich out of his office, he then does give Palovich's information back to Warsaw. And Warsaw goes, aha, because Warsaw was expecting this type of outreach, because the Americans had already done it to Hungary. And Warsaw goes, aha, here's the outreach. Let's call him back up. So they called Palovich back up in his home, because Palovich had given Tomaszewski his home number. And they said, "Yeah, will you bring a team back to Lisbon? We'd like to begin meetings with you." And so the meetings began first in Lisbon in May of 1990, and then they were transferred later on to Warsaw in July of 1990. And then in September of 1990, after Saddam had invaded Iraq, the Americans had a problem, because we had 6 people in Baghdad whom we needed to have extracted. One of them was extremely important. He had all of Norman Schwarzkopf's plans how to undo Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. So they needed to be moved out very rapidly. The United States had contacted a bunch of other countries already. They had said, we're too busy getting our own people out. So finally, the American CIA station chief in Warsaw, Bill Norville, reaches out to Krzysztof Kozłowski, who was the head of the American department of the UOP at the time, that's the Polish intelligence agency, and said, "Hey, can you help us out? We need to move 6 guys out." And within a day, the Polish spy agency, approved by Andrzej Milczanowski, who at the time was the head of the UOP, made the decision, yes, we will help the Americans. Now, Kozłowski, the head of the American division, was an ex-communist spy. Andrei Milutinovsky had been a solidarity activist, had done jail time. So you can see at the time already there's a mix between the solidarity people and the ex-communist people working together to make decisions.
Yep, no, that doesn't surprise me. Like, because very well with always cooperation between them. What happened next?
So then the question is, initially they thought they could rely on the local station, the UOP station, the Polish Spy Agency station in Baghdad. But after a couple of weeks, clearly they were not capable of carrying out the operation. So the initial idea was to let Kozłowski go down there and do it. Smolensky down there and do it, but Smolensky couldn't. The Americans liked him too much as a liaison officer. So the decision was made to send another officer who had just returned from counterterrorism training in the United States, and his name was Gromosław Czempiński. And Czempiński was sort of a heralded Warsaw Pact officer for Polish intelligence. He'd been posted in New York, he'd been posted to Chicago, he'd been posted to Geneva, and he had this great reputation as being a real professional. And they sent him down in October of 1990 on basically an empty LOT Airlines flight. The only other person was the new Polish ambassador to Iraq named Plemiński. He was sent down there together, and Czempiński lands in Baghdad and tries to figure out what to do.
And what did he do?
So he's traveling under an assumed identity as a second secretary at the Polish embassy, but he quickly realizes that as a diplomat, he can't move around Baghdad at all. But he learns that as a Polish, if he becomes a Polish business executive, because remember, there were lots of Polish companies doing infrastructure development work like road building in Iraq at the time. If he gets the identity of a Polish executive, a businessman of a state-owned company, he can move much more freely. So he adopts a third identity, which is Polish business executive. And he then begins to try to figure out ways how to get these guys out, these 6 Americans out. And through sources that the embassy had cultivated and that he had cultivated previously in Geneva, he finds the wife of a woman who worked in the Ministry of Transportation in Iraq. He, through her, gets the Americans exit visas in 6 fake Polish passports that the Americans and the Poles had made together. He then finds the Americans, he gives them these old workers' overalls, basically dressing them up as drunken Polish workers. And ultimately, in middle October of 1990, through a hair-raising adventure, he drives them out of Iraq into Turkey, and then they're brought to Warsaw and handed back over to the CIA.
Wow, the CIA must have been very pleased.
They were extremely pleased, and so pleased actually that William Webster, who at the time was the director of the CIA, came to Poland in November 1990 on his first trip, and it was a secret trip to Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Okay. The relationship was very good at that point.
Yeah, so that basically opens the floodgates for all sorts of joint operations. So much so that by 2001, 2002, the then CIA director, George Tenet, in a letter to Bogdan Libera, who at the time was the just retired chief of the UOP, basically in that letter, he said, with your country, we now have the second best intelligence cooperative relationship than we've ever had, which is pretty extraordinary given America's very close intelligence ties with Great Britain, Australia, Israel, etc.
Okay, what would have been the first?
The first would probably be with Great Britain.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay, that's surprising. I would have thought Israel would be pretty higher than Poland for sure.
Exactly, but I think people don't know how close the relationship had become.
Yeah,
Poles were operating on behalf of the United States all over the world in many countries where the United States couldn't operate. Because if you recall, we have 1989, 1990, the shift to the Republic of Poland. but Poland still has embassies all over the world in places where America can't operate: North Korea, Iran, Cuba, and many other places. And also great contacts in the former Soviet Union. So, for example, there was a legendary Polish intelligence officer named Sadowicz who was posted for years in Moscow and as a liaison with the KGB. And what the Polish UOP does is they turn Sadowicz and they make him the station chief of Polish intelligence in Moscow, allowing him to still being able to leverage all of his contacts, but in this case, not cooperating with the Russians, but reporting on the Russians. And there were people like that all over the world who kind of switched hats. And one could criticize Poland for not cleansing the UOP of all communist influence, but at the same time, these people, from my perspective, maintain their loyalty to the Polish state. And when the Polish state changed its allegiance, they began working with and for the Americans instead of against the Americans, and providing the United States with crucial intelligence from all over the world.
The US is getting a lot out of the relationship, and Poland also gets a lot out of it. NATO and all that, correct?
Yes, yes. And of course, Poland got NATO, which is huge. I mean, as you know better than anybody else, Poland is basically a flat country. So it's on an invasion route. So if it's not the Russians, it's the Swedes, it's the Germans, it's the Austro-Hungarians, right? I mean, and so the NATO, extension to NATO solved, at least temporarily, Poland's centuries-long struggle with how to maintain security in an extremely dangerous neighborhood.
Yes, yes. And both are even still very concerned. Just yesterday, our defense minister introduced a new law expanding our army because of a threat of basically Russian and Belarusian other intrigues. Polish people are extremely worried about this. Yeah, absolutely. And as I said, not only do we see the Americans, or a lot of people did see the Americans of being saviors to protect us from the Russians, but we also really liked American culture, the cowboys, like all the freedom, the liberty. Well, Polish people are very freedom-loving people. Are there any revelations or anything that you found surprising while researching your book?
One of the things I thought was interesting is, to your point, that if you look at the career of Jerzy Koźmiński, who was the Polish ambassador to the United States for 6 years, it's pretty extraordinary, because while Koźmiński was the ambassador, the Polish political situation was chaotic, to say the least. I think there were 4 or 5 prime ministers, maybe 6 or 7 defense ministers, a whole bunch of different intelligence chiefs. But during that whole period, as Poland sought to get into NATO, Koźmiński was the ambassador. And it shows that, to your point, despite the complexity and the fractious nature of the Poland internal political situation, all of the Polish political parties, left, right, center, far right, far left, were basically united in their belief that a strong relationship with the United States was central to the security of Poland. And I think you can also include the ex-communists in that. I mean, President Alexander Kwaśniewski and Prime Minister Leszek Miller were extremely supportive, very supportive of Poland's extension to NATO. In fact, they presided over it as well.
Yes, and speaking of those guys, we're also very supportive of American wars in Iraq. George W. Bush famously said, "Don't forget about Poland," because Poland helped, right?
And so that leads into one of the problems in the relationship. And it's very funny, because back in 1994, a station chief of the CIA, in speaking with his Polish counterparts, said to them, "Hey, this is 1994. We have a great relationship now, but I have to warn you that I think that at a certain point in our future, we're going to screw you. And we're probably not going to screw you like the Soviets screwed you. We're going to do it in a very a way in which we think we're being well-meaning." And that ultimately happened. And one could argue that it happened in Iraq, and I'll get to that in a second, but it also happened after 9/11, when the CIA and George W. Bush came to Poland and basically requested that terrorist suspects who had been captured around the world could be warehoused in Poland so that CIA interrogators could question them. And it's very difficult, it was very difficult for Poland to say no to the United States. And if you think about Kwasniewski's situation, I mean, this is a guy that, you know, and looking at Poland's history, the CIA and the United States government had been very supportive of solidarity. The CIA and the United States government had been extremely supportive of Poland's transition to a republic. The CIA and the American government had been very supportive of Poland's extension to NATO, and also extremely supportive of Poland's negotiations to enter the European Union. So basically, Poland's perspective was America has basically had Poland's back for decades now, despite the sins of 1949, right, and the Yalta Conference. But that's another story. And so when America came calling, and when George W. Bush directly asked Kwasniewski to open a black site on Polish territory, Kwasniewski basically, it's very hard to say no to the United States. So he said yes. He didn't know what was going to happen later with allegations of torture, et cetera, but he said yes. And then the CIA, so Poland at the time asked the CIA to sign a memorandum of understanding that would guarantee at least minimum standards of treatment for these prisoners. The CIA refused to sign, and still Poland agreed anyway. And then the CIA, this Poland government also told the CIA, look, you have to keep this secret, but sadly the CIA leaked on it from Poland's perspective. And Poland basically felt, Kwasniewski, Miller, and other people felt like they were left kind of holding the bag and dealing with the political blowback of an operation that they thought would be kept secret.
Speaking of that political blowback, we'll get into it. But the reaction in Poland politically, it's very unclear because those guys are no longer relevant, right? And their political party is no longer relevant, right? So it's not like either of the major parties can attack the other one for doing this. These guys were being brought into Poland. Could you describe what happened to some of these men who were tortured in Poland?
Well, yeah, so they were interrogated using what the CIA called enhanced interrogation techniques, which involved, in many cases, waterboarding, but other things, a lot of physical slapping, what they call walling, which is they slam them up against the wall, sleep deprivation, all sorts of variety of techniques that have been in the United States categorized as torture. And one of the most important of the CIA terrorist suspects was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was waterboarded on numerous occasions during his stay in March of 2003 in Poland. Ultimately, it was shut down in September of that year, and upwards of 11 men might have transited through this two-story villa on the grounds of the Polish intelligence agency's training ground in Stare Kiekucie, up in the Missouri Lakes region.
One of the allegations I've heard was that, well, this is going on to YouTube, people were anally raped, if you get my meaning.
Right. You know, as to what happened inside, there's been two cases brought to the European Court of Human Rights by two of the prisoners at the site. And they never could, they made allegations and they won those cases. And there was a judgment passed against Poland in terms of basically accusing Poland of being a party to torture and illegal treatment of prisoners. And so I can't speak to I mean, there's lots of allegations floating around about what happened to people. Clearly what happened to them qualifies as torture. As to the specifics, it's you know, in many cases, it's sort of your word against somebody else's word, but clearly they were tortured. I don't know the exact details of what happened to them.
There's another trial going on. I believe it's ongoing in the United States Supreme Court. It is.
So yeah, this is an interesting, very interesting case, and it has direct relevance to Poland. So during the Donald Tusk administration, in the mid-2000s, an investigation was started by Polish prosecutors in Warsaw to see whether any Polish officials had broken the law in approving or monitoring or even participating in the black site. And apparently one Polish official was indicted in relation to this, but it's unclear whether unusually the indictment was kept secret, although the Polish media reported about it. But he was never prosecuted for his alleged crimes. And then
I'm not familiar with him. Was he alleged to have actually participated in?
No, he was
No.
alleged to have approved what
Okay.
was considered to be what could be perceived as or potentially prosecuted as an illegal prison on Polish territory, right?
Sure. Yeah, because
So
all of his.
he was not charged with actually participating in torture, right?
Sure. It is something that Poland is quite sensitive with because, of course, we had very brutal torture during many eras of our history. So this is not something that Polish people approve of at all.
Totally. And but the interesting thing is that, and these are what some people have thought, that the people who approved these operations
Mm-hmm.
were actually ex-communists. And
Mm-hmm.
so during communism, the communist times, they were not on the wrong side of the law, quote unquote, then. So none of them had direct experience with sort of the mistreatment under the by the hands of Zomo or these other very tough SB organizations. And so there is an idea that Krasniewski and Miller were more willing to approve such things because they didn't really understand how the rest of Polish society might react. And people have hypothesized that should Solidarity have been running the government at the time, they would have had a more ability to push back at these ideas. But because Krasniewski was an ex-communist and Miller are ex-communists, they were under a lot of pressure by the CIA at the time to prove that they were loyal to America and loyal to the alliance. If you can see how the CIA potentially could have manipulated that, it's quite clear. That's a little psycho sort of dime store psychology on their decisions. But the fact remains that the United States was considered by Poland to be its most important alliance at the time, although times have changed, and in many ways the EU is more important to Poland now than America was. But at the time, America was really important to Poland. And so when America came asking, it was very difficult for the Polish government to say no.
And I'd like to talk about a guy named Abu Zubaydah.
Zubaydah.
Zubaydah. Okay, sorry, Abu Zubaydah. Is he Palestinian?
Right, he's a Palestinian, and
okay.
he was brought to Stare Kykutie in 2003.
Do you know why?
So they alleged that he was really important in the Al Qaeda structure. It turns out that they were wrong, and he isn't.
He's currently in Guantanamo Bay, I believe.
Held in Guantanamo. Yes.
Okay. So this guy arrested falsely, have been allegedly tortured in Poland. Let's just say he was tortured in Poland, and he's been held for 20 years. How horrific, terrible. I know he is currently in the Supreme Court arguing his case of the United States versus Abu Zubaydah.
Right.
And I read the headlines that during the proceedings, when they were arguing what evidence should be allowed in the trial, one of the US Supreme Court judges said that because they made a promise to Poland that there would be certain things he would not be allowed to admit in court, correct?
So yes, the issue, so after there was a Warsaw investigation, right, by the Polish prosecutor, that was either wrapped up or stopped. And then after the European Court of Human Rights issued its judgment in favor of Abu Zubaydah and al-Nashiri, a second prisoner, a second investigation was begun in Krakow by a Polish prosecutor. And that investigation is looking at exactly what happened to these people and whether, in continuation of the first investigation, Polish officials or Polish officers committed any crimes. And one of the key issues that investigation is trying to look at is whether Polish officers or officials were present inside this villa during the interrogations, whether they were actually directly involved in any of the torture that happened. And Zubaydah might know. He might have heard people speaking Polish, right? And that's one of the things that they're trying to determine, because from the beginning, after the Polish government finally acknowledged that, yes, this site happened, and yes, we gave the Americans approval. But even though they acknowledge that, they've always maintained that there were no Polish officials or Polish officers allowed in the site, right?
Okay.
They said we said the Americans could have this villa, but our hands are clean because we were not involved in any of this stuff. We couldn't even go into the villa. That's what they've maintained from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And what the Krakow prosecutor is trying to determine is whether they're lying or not.
Okay.
And they think that if they talk to Zubadeh or if they talk to the two U.S. contractors who were doing the interrogation, they might be able to discover that Polish officials, they think they might be able to discover whether Polish officials were or weren't on that site. And that's very important for the Polish investigation.
If this guy is innocent, why is he still being held by the Americans?
Great question. That's a great question. I have no idea.
We definitely need to shed light on it.
No, I totally agree with you. It doesn't make any sense at all to me why he's still being held if he's innocent. And everyone said that he's innocent, or wasn't involved to the extent that the Americans thought he was involved in terrorist activities.
Okay.
Now there are lawyers in America that are trying to fight for his freedom, but
right.
And the other issue is if he gets let out, where can he go?
Yeah. Let's talk about present day. What do you think of the relationship between the CIA and Poland today?
Well, it's clear that there's still a very close relationship. And partially because initially when I was doing research for the book, the CIA was interested in cooperating, but because of the internal political situation in Poland, the ex-communist officers are being targeted, at least they feel they're being targeted by the current Polish government with the whole 2015 pension reform and how many of them saw their pensions cut to below the poverty level.
Mm-hmm.
And so they feel that they're being menaced and targeted by the current government.
Mm-hmm.
And the CIA, not wanting to alienate the current government, the Law and Justice Party, made the decision not to cooperate with the book, I think because, again, they have a good cooperative relationship with Polish intelligence, and they don't want to get involved in a domestic political catfight between the ex-communist officers who were actually at the forefront of forging this unlikely alliance, and the current Polish government, which still believes that in the necessity of punishing these men, and many of them are in their 70s, for alleged crimes they committed during communism.
Yeah. Yep. That's an accurate reading of the situation. So what sources did you use for your book?
So the IPN, the Museum of National Remembrance, has declassified a lot of documents about the early stage of the relationship, and that was very useful. Former Polish officers were very cooperative. Former Polish diplomats were extremely cooperative as well, as were current Polish officials in addition. And then on the US side, ex-CIA officers were very helpful. The CIA could have stopped them from speaking with me, and I'm sure they probably rang the request up the flagpole, but they weren't stopped.
Okay.
Which, from my perspective, gave me the feeling, and I don't know whether this is true or not, that at least that there was tacit agreement on the part of the CIA to allow me to get some research done. The CIA didn't do a full court press and block me at every turn. So officially they didn't cooperate, but unofficially, at least they let these guys speak. But again, I don't know for a fact whether they actually requested permission from the CIA to speak. But my sense is they might have.
One last question I had. Do you think your book will ruffle any feathers?
Perhaps in Poland. I think it's already ruffled some feathers. There's been some blowback in some of the reporting I did on the ex-defense minister, Antoni Macierewicz.
What did you say about him?
Well, when he was Minister of Interior in 1992, with the conservative government that was elected then, he reinstituted surveillance on the U.S. Embassy. And the U.S. Embassy, both Ambassador Tom Simons, but also the station chief, Bill Norval, told the Polish government that, hey, if you're going to, if you want us to be an ally, you got to stop snooping us again. And Maciejewicz, some of his, he hasn't directly denied it, but some of his friends and colleagues and spokespeople, if you will, have denied it but I don't believe the denial. I think that my reporting is correct.
I don't understand why that would be controversial.
Well, generally speaking, if you want to be an ally, you don't monitor who comes and goes from the embassy, especially at that point when the alliance just really begun. I mean, he was doing what the communists were doing. He redeployed security officers in a small booth near the embassy where they were monitoring the comings and goings of Polish people into the embassy. Basically, it was like kind of returning to the communist era, how they treated the U.S. diplomats, and Simons would have none of it. Any protested it to the Polish government, and Bill Norville did the same through his channels with the UOP.
Okay. It's a fascinating topic. Well, thank you for writing it. It's great to have all these sources of this history being written. Where can people find your book?
So they can buy it on Amazon, also at your local bookstore. Or you can look on my website if you want an autographed copy, and I'll send you one. My website is johnpomfret.com.
You ship to Poland?
I can ship to Poland. Yes, it's relatively expensive. So there's no international media mail. So it costs about $20 plus to ship to Poland.
And you said the Polish version will be coming out soon.
There's a Polish edition that will be published by Znak in 2022.
John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for having me.